IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio. IndyPram, yes, IndyPram on IndyLive.Radio.
Welcome to the IndyPram Podcast on Independence Live Radio. Scotland the Brief by Gordon MacIntyre-Kemp, Part 5. The Balance of Powers versus Powers for a Purpose. Devolution is a good thing. It allows some of the key decisions that impact the people of Scotland to be made by politicians elected solely by the people of Scotland, who have a goal of doing what is best for Scotland. That's a view that is almost universally accepted in the mainstream of Scottish politics. What is less obvious, though, is why the line dividing the powers of the Scottish and UK parliaments is drawn precisely where it is. As we have already discussed in the governance chapter, there is a majority in Scotland for far more powers to be devolved. This chapter will outline the powers Scotland's parliament possesses and the powers it does not, in order to help you decide for yourself what powers the Scottish Parliament needs and why. It is also worth noting that many of those powers are partial and that Westminster still retains overall control in those areas. It is also the case that a power devolved to the Scottish Parliament can be taken back. Power devolved is essentially power retained. Indeed, to deliver trade deals after Brexit, the UK government has gone to the Supreme Court to ensure that it can intercept the powers previously shared with the EU from coming under the control of the Scottish Government after Brexit. So, who runs Scotland? Here is a list of the UK government powers. Constitutional Affairs, Defence, Foreign Affairs and International Relations, Fiscal and Monetary Policy, 70% of total taxes raised in Scotland, Economic Policy, the Crown, Copyright, Treason, Firearms, Extradition, Employment Law, Money Laundering, Financial Services, Immigration, National Security, Competition, Product Standards, Telecommunications, Intellectual Property, Import and Export Control, Postal Services, Nuclear Energy, Coal, Oil and Gas, General Taxation, the ability to set tax bands and set personal allowances or dividend and savings income. Transport, including road, rail and air transport. Most social security and benefits, 85% of the total Scottish benefits bill. Pensions, health and safety, industrial relations, abortion, embryology, medicine, broadcasting, nuclear weapons renewal, ordnance surveys, time, consumer rights, and data protection. Scottish Government powers. Agriculture, forestry and fisheries. Very limited borrowing powers. The Scottish Government can borrow up to £600 million per year, limited to £1.75 billion overall, but only for cash management or forecast errors. Education and training, environment, economic development, health and social services, housing, energy is partially devolved, the fire service, law, order and justice, local government, planning, social work, sport and the arts, tourism and economic development, many aspects of local transport, Scottish road network, bus policy, ports, harbours, operation of railways but not rail track and infrastructure. Some taxes, including land and buildings transaction tax, air passenger duty and landfill tax. Income tax, with the ability to differentiate the rate of income in each band by plus or minus 2%. Crown estate, with powers over revenue and management. Onshore oil and gas licensing. Some social security, including housing benefit, disability living allowance, personal independence payment, attendance allowance, carers allowance, industrial injuries benefits, winter fuel payments, Sure Start maternity grant, and cold weather payments. VAT. The first 10p of standard rate, the first 2.5p of reduced rate of Scottish VAT, and setting the VAT remains reserved. Powers for a purpose. Independence for Scotland should not be seen as an end in itself, but rather as a means to an end. There are many similarities, culturally, politically and economically between Scotland and the UK, and indeed with many other European nations, but each has its own bespoke economic and social policy needs. The EU referendum brought into sharp focus the stark difference in the political priorities of different parts of the UK nations. The political parties which Scotland elects compared to the rest of the UK also speaks to a different set of values. As a result, a one-size-fits-all politics does not work. If it did, Scotland wouldn't need the devolution it already has, and it wouldn't be so popular in Scotland. The whole point of Scotland becoming independent is so that a Scottish government can access the full set of powers of an independent sovereign nation to make different decisions and create policy positions that are tailored to the particular economic and social needs and the values of Scotland. The way in which the full powers of independence would be used would depend completely on who wins Scottish general elections following independence. However, what we can be certain of is that an independent Scottish government of any colour will have vastly more power, flexibility and policy options than are open to a current Scottish government, and that policies will be tailored to Scotland's needs, not to the UK's very different economic and social policy requirements. We have looked at the powers. Now let us consider the positive possibilities of power. Take a minute to ask yourself, if you were all-powerful, in a political sense, and you could implement any policy you wanted without restrictions, what 5 big changes would you put in place to make Scotland a better nation? Your 5 big ideas can be a mix of any policy area: economics, social security, finance, taxation, or pensions, for instance. As an example, 5 big changes could include: 1. Gradually increasing the value of pensions until we match the OECD average as a means to end pensioner poverty. 2. Raising the minimum wage to the real living wage, ending in-work poverty and making more people, young people in particular, economically active. 3. Redesigning corporation tax so that companies who do not benefit Scotland pay a full rate of 20% rather than the planned UK figure of 17% by 2020. Companies that invest in research and development, employ young and unemployed people, pay the living wage, increase exports, and have gender balance in pay levels would benefit from corporation tax credits that will mean they pay as little as 16%. Thus, Scottish-based businesses would be more competitive than those elsewhere. Any cost of cutting corporation tax is paid for by higher tax and national insurance contributions and offset by a lower welfare bill. This will have other benefits such as sustainable economic growth and an even better balance of payments. 4. Gradually reintroducing taxation on the oil industry, which is currently highly profitable, and thus resetting Scotland's finances as we leave the UK to the default setting of stronger than the rest of the UK. This would be followed by ring-fencing those reinstated tax revenues for reinvestment into renewable energy, which would have the potential to transform the northeast of Scotland into a world leader in renewable energy technologies. 5. Finally, transforming the fortunes of rural Scotland by creating a Scottish Citizens Bank that would take over bank branches being closed by the high street banks, creating rural banking, post office and community hubs. That could be accompanied by an introduction of zero VAT on rural hospitality and tourism-related activities, a generous grant scheme for young people and skilled immigrants to start up businesses in rural Scotland, thereby repopulating and reinvigorating the rural economies and saving schools and communities in some of the most attractive but underpopulated places to live in Europe. None of these big ideas, not one, comes even remotely under the powers of the devolved Parliament. How about your ideas? If your list has more than one or two that can be implemented with the powers of devolved Parliament, it must look pretty unambitious. That is not an insult. The Scottish Parliament's limited powers are designed to limit Scotland's ambitions. Devolution and ill-defined concepts such as Devo Max, even federalism, can be likened to playing golf with only 3 clubs or a racing car with only 2 gears. You are just not going to be as effective as you would be with all the golf clubs you need to win. With independence, you get a complete set of tools to run a country. Finally, let us consider federalism, as the Labour Party has been championing a move to a federal system of United Kingdom government. Federalism, or Devo Max, would involve all of the above powers and related infrastructure transferring to the Scottish Government, while Scotland remained in the UK, with the exception of defence, foreign policy and remaining welfare policies. The problem is that several unsolved flaws with the idea of federalism as an alternative to independence. The first is the powers that Westminster retains. Defence, renewing nuclear weapons, involvement in illegal wars. Foreign policy, leaving the EU, the single market and customs union, and agreeing to immigration deals with other nations. Welfare, setting the pensions rate, universal credits, the bedroom tax and so on. Those are not the last 3 powers to leave the UK government. Those are the first 3 powers that a progressive nation needs to control. Secondly, the real problem with the idea of a federal Britain as a radical alternative to independence is that it cannot be implemented without the permission of the rest of the UK. It is universally accepted that Scotland can vote to become an independent nation following an independent supporting majority in the Scottish Parliament, as first occurred in 2011 and again in the current Parliament. However, the conclusions of a House of Lords report on the Constitution that stated, while independence is a matter for the people of Scotland, federalism would have to win a UK-wide referendum, is also universally accepted. Simply put, there is not enough support for federalism or regional parliaments in England, where the vast majority of UK voters live, and in Northern Ireland the DUP would argue it diminishes their status as British. Thirdly, there is also the problem that federal-level powers cannot be given to regional governments for maybe as long as a decade, as they would all then possess a veto on any post-Brexit international trade deals. Federalism, much like devolution, is entirely incompatible with Brexit. Hence why the UK government went to the Supreme Court to be able to grab powers from the Scottish Parliament for 7 years. Finally, the political problem. In order to sell federalism to the population of the UK, the pro-union parties would have to admit that Westminster governance is no longer fit for purpose. They would have to make the case that all those powers that pro-union parties have been arguing against Scotland possessing would now somehow suddenly be better under Scottish Parliament control. To sell federalism requires its champions to dismantle the core case for unionism and then to run a referendum campaign with the goal of only retaining the powers over defence, foreign policy and the remaining welfare policies at Westminster, which are arguably the 3 policy areas where the case for the Union is most vulnerable. Federalism would also split the pro-UK vote in 2 and rule out scaremongering as a campaign technique, because the Federalists would have to argue against the economic and fiscal powers at the heart of federalism. In summary, devolution has been a positive mood, but the UK government still runs Scotland from Westminster using the vast majority of major economic and social powers. The powers that Scotland does possess are often limited by partial devolution. The lack of interconnected and interdependent powers and economic levers to create joined-up policies, as well as the fact that Westminster policies may run contrary to the wishes of the people of Scotland and its Parliament. The limited powers of the Scottish Parliament limit Scotland's ambitions. Devolution Max and federalism are highly problematic to define, almost impossible to sell to the population of the UK as a whole, and still leave some of the most vital powers Scotland needs under Westminster control. Observations. The distinction between those arguing for independence and those arguing for the Union is that the former are ambitious for Scotland and the latter are not. The dividing line is between those who believe in Scotland and those who do not. Federalism is not a realistic option, but it will almost certainly be offered in an ill-defined way as an alternative to independence. The values and political priorities of Scotland and the rest of the UK have been diverging for a generation. Brexit may have broken Britain as a political union, but Scotland does not need to have Westminster limit its ambitions, its international trade, and adversely affect the welfare and well-being of its people in order to remain the closest friends, trading partners, allies, and neighbours to the nations and peoples of the rest of the UK. Is it better to be a big nation, or is smaller size an advantage? Scotland is generally referred to as a small nation. The fact is that Scotland is smaller than the rest of the UK in terms of population, but this does not mean it is small when it comes to its economic performance and capabilities. Scotland is no minnow economically. Of the 10 smallest nations by population across the European Economic Area, Scotland's economy is larger than the smallest 7 put together. They are Liechtenstein, Iceland, Malta, Luxembourg, Cyprus, Estonia and Latvia. In terms of territory, Scotland makes up 32% of the UK's landmass, but when you add in territorial waters, Scotland is actually 1.5 times larger than England, with Scotland accounting for 55% of the UK's territorial area against England at 37%. You may think that the last fact, including territorial waters, is a little academic, but Scotland's seas contribute greatly to Scotland's natural wealth, with Scotland possessing 96% of the UK's oil and gas, 63% of its natural gas, 70% of its seafood landing, 10% of Europe's wave power potential, and 25% of Europe's tidal energy resources. There is no clear or standardised definition about what constitutes a small nation. It's all about perception, and Scotland, having a smaller population than England, is therefore perceived to be small. An independent Scotland would be smaller than the UK in population terms, thus the overall size of its economy would be smaller. However, is that a problem or an advantage? It is important to note that a smaller economy would not necessarily mean a less wealthy nation. The wealth of a nation is better measured in GDP per head, and Scotland is £900 per head larger than the UK average. The UK versus smaller European states. We gathered economic data for the geographically closest northern, western, central and western European nations commonly referred to as small, and benchmarked their performance against the UK. In population terms, the nations considered ranged from Iceland with a population of 338,349 to the Netherlands with just over 17 million, which is equivalent to 26% of the UK's population. The smaller benchmark nations compared include Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Estonia, Finland, Iceland, Ireland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden and Switzerland. We looked into the GDP per head and the national debt of a country as a percentage of its GDP, the balance of trade, which is the exports of goods minus the imports, productivity indices, and pensions as a percentage of average income. We chose those measures to provide a more well-rounded picture of the economic performance of those countries. The results show that all those benchmark European nations perceived to be small have for decades been outperforming the UK, which is one of Europe's largest states and economies. In particular, when it comes to the GDP per head, the UK comes second to last in the group, beating only Estonia. But Estonia's national debt is 10 times less than the UK's. Its exports as a percentage of GDP are more than twice as high, and its pensions are almost double the UK's as a percentage of final earnings. So, The small nation that the UK performs best against, but still loses 3-2 overall, is Estonia, which has a population of 1.3 million and only became independent from the USSR in 1991. Of the benchmark group, the UK had the second worst national debt as a percentage of GDP with 86%, bettering only Belgium at 100%. Meanwhile, the UK came last with the worst ratio of exports as a percentage of GDP with 31%, and the UK has by far the worst pensions of a percentage of average earnings at 29%. Ireland comes second last for the pensions at 42%, but this is still 13% higher than in the UK. In terms of productivity, the UK again only beats tiny Estonia. Smaller Northern European nations such as Denmark and Norway could take an extra day off work and still produce more per worker than the UK, while Sweden could take a half day. Taking a look at the smaller independent European nations with the most similar population levels to Scotland, we find the following comparisons. Denmark 5.8 million, Finland 5.5 million, Scotland 5.4 million, Norway 5.3 million, Ireland 4.8 million. Now we look at GDP in relation to the size of the economy. Norway £332 billion, Ireland £291 billion, Denmark £264 billion, Finland £209 billion, Scotland as part of the UK £179 billion. Those other nations all have economies considerably larger than Scotland's, which has a GDP of $179 billion despite having a smaller size population of 5.4 million. However, on a per-head basis, Scotland's GDP in 2018 works out at £32,800 per person, a whole £900 higher than the UK's at £31,900. So something is clearly wrong, but not with Scotland's economy. Scotland possesses massively higher natural wealth than all of the smaller sized nations listed, with the possible exception of Norway. Meanwhile, Scotland outperforms all of the small nations and similar sized nations highlighted in this section across the broad range of prosperity factors. Yes, our GDP is £90 billion smaller than the average of our near neighbours with similar population sizes, and a massive £112 billion smaller than Ireland, which has 600,000 fewer people. That demonstrates that smaller, independent nations perform better. Observations. Given its huge economic assets, it naturally follows that Scotland should be performing better than most, if not all of those smaller nations we have benchmarked against. The fact that it doesn't therefore points to a very important conclusion, that being part of the UK is holding Scotland's economy back and limiting the shared prosperity of the nation. Ask yourself, other than possessing the full set of powers of an independent nation and the ability to tailor economic, business, social and environmental policies to the needs of their nations rather than to those of a larger neighbouring nation, what advantages do those nations of a similar size to Scotland possess that Scotland doesn't? All data points to smaller developed countries having an advantage. As an independent nation, Scotland would have a smaller population than the UK, but it would have significantly larger prospects and ambitions. Is Britain's economy broken? Smaller independent nations are outperforming the UK economically. This has led countries of similar population sizes, but which possess significantly inferior economic assets to Scotland, to develop larger economies than Scotland's, as Scotland seems to be held back by being part of the larger UK. This leads to the conclusion that being part of the UK is stopping Scotland from achieving its full economic potential. As detailed in the last chapter, smaller, more agile nations, able to tailor policy solutions more closely to their needs than Scotland can, whilst still part of the UK, will always perform better than the UK as a whole. A one-size-fits-all economic policy, including related corporate taxation and fiscal, business and immigration policy clearly doesn't deliver for the diverse and geographically disparate economy of Scotland. If it did, and being part of the UK was an economic advantage, Scotland would outperform all similar-sized nations with fewer economic assets. This leads to the question, is the UK's economy okay? Is the poor performance of the UK economy itself weighing Scotland down? To investigate this, we measured the UK's performance across 7 indicators, 5 standard economic performance measures and 2 key economic well-being measures. We then benchmarked the UK's results against 16 variously sized Northern and Western European nations. The economic performance indicators were pensions as a percentage of average final income, income inequality, GDP per head, GDP growth per year, national debt as a percentage of GDP, exports of goods as a percentage of GDP, productivity per person per hour worked, ranking 1 to 17 across all economic indicators. Position 1, Luxembourg. 2, Iceland. 3, Denmark. 4, the Netherlands. 5, Ireland. 6, Austria. 7, Norway. 8, Switzerland. 9, Belgium. 10, Sweden. 11th, Estonia. 12th, Lithuania. 13th, Finland. 14th, Latvia. 15th, France. 16th, Germany. 17th, United Kingdom. Looking at pensions as a percentage of average earnings. Netherlands, 100.6%. Austria, 91.8%. Luxembourg, 88.4%. Denmark, 70.2%. Iceland, 75.7%. United Kingdom, 29% and 17th position. Right, the economic performance indicators in relation to GDP per capita. 1. Luxembourg, 114,234. Second, Switzerland, 82,950. Third, Norway, 81,694. Fourth, Ireland, 76,098. Fifth, Iceland, 74,278. 14th, UK, 42,558. Income inequality, Iceland came top, followed by Norway, Denmark, Belgium and Finland in 5th. UK, 16th position in Europe. GDP growth 2018, top place went to Ireland with 6.7%, second Latvia 4.8%, Iceland 4.6%, Estonia 3.9%, fifth Lithuania 3.5%, United Kingdom came in at 13th with 1.4%. The results were conclusive. The UK is not okay. Far from it. The UK's economy is performing extremely poorly, and being part of it is not an advantage to Scotland. Overall, the UK came last, not once making a top 10, and, as you would expect from reading the previous chapter, smaller nations significantly outperform the larger ones. Germany and France, the other two big nations, came second and third last, respectively. The UK comes last on 4 out of the 8 indicators, including on overall performance. Even where it recorded its highest rank on GDP growth, it was equal last at 13th. The UK only outperformed Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia on productivity and GDP per capita, which were its best results. But that clearly isn't something to boast about. Lithuania actually finished 5 places ahead of the UK overall as a result of performing extremely well in other metrics. On national debt, the UK did manage to come in 15th, beating both France at 16th and Belgium at 17th. However, this result is partly due to the UK's greater emphasis on reducing its deficit through austerity, which has clearly lost its points in other key measures such as GDP growth. It is therefore no surprise that the UK performs even worse on well-being indicators. On pensions, the UK was so far behind the others that it is worth noting that it offered the lowest pension in the developed world as a percentage of final income. Meanwhile, the UK has the second worst income inequality behind only Lithuania, which, as mentioned, performs well on other metrics. If we look at national debt as a percentage of GDP, Estonia has 8.4%, Luxembourg 22.94%, Latvia 32.9%, Denmark 35.88%, Lithuania 36.52%, United Kingdom 86.34%. If we look at productivity per person per hour worked, Ireland 194.6, Luxembourg 160.3, Norway 131.1, Belgium 128.1, Switzerland 122.3, United Kingdom 99.4%. If we look at exports as a percentage of GDP, Luxembourg 230%, Ireland 120%, Netherlands 86%, Belgium 85%, Lithuania 81%, United Kingdom 30%. Observations. The idea that the size of the UK's economy, its performance, or even its long-term economic prospects offer Scotland some form of protection or advantage has been completely and utterly disproven by the data. The clear dominance of smaller nations in these league tables and the fact that even the manufacturing powerhouse of Germany could not get out of the bottom three is highly informative. The top 5 overall placement of Ireland and Iceland, the former an EU member and the latter a member of the single market via its EFTA status, also demonstrates that those nations which, like the UK, took a hit from the 2007 financial crash, have bounced back stronger, faster, and with greater equality throughout society than the UK, which instead chose an austerity route to deal with the crash. The UK's terrible scores on both pension levels and the income inequality prove that the wealth in the economy is not reaching those who need it most. You gain a glimpse of the soul of a nation by looking at how it treats its most economically deprived and its aged. The UK is still the world's 5th largest economy, but Westminster doesn't care as much as other nations about inequality and pensioners. It is the case that 1. Scotland possesses greater natural wealth and many other significant economic advantages compared to most European nations. 2. Smaller nations are more agile, and so the limited powers of devolution will have provided some economic benefit. 3. The UK is performing badly and holding Scotland back. It naturally follows that Scotland's economy would outperform the UK on economic indicators shown in this chapter. Scotland's economy in brief. Scotland is not an independent country, and so its economy is both treated and measured as a region of the UK. Therefore, much of the data available is not compiled in the same way as it is for other nations. There are often vastly contrasting figures for the same question from different official sources. For example, the UK and Scottish governments both state that the space industry in Scotland has a turnover of 150 million and employs 7,500 people. If this were the case, the sector would be bankrupt, and yet it is not. That is because the UK government allocates the turnover to where the location of the industry headquarters are and not where the work is done. We spoke to London-based ADS Group, the Aerospace, Defence and Security Trade Group, who agreed that given that the percentage of UK space sector employment in Scotland is 18%, a more realistic turnover figure would be £2.6 billion. Given the Scottish Government has a strategy to raise the turnover of the space sector to £4 billion in the next 10 years, they know it's a £2.6 billion turnover industry, not a £150 million one. Such is the convoluted way that the Scottish economic data needs to be calculated as part of the UK. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's a lot harder. The data we can access therefore demonstrates how Scotland's economy performs only as part of the UK and all that entails. Crucially, that data tells us very little of how Scotland's economy would have performed as an independent nation over the same period. What we can do, though, is research Scotland's core strengths and its economic assets and benchmark performance to project how an independent Scotland should perform. That is the purpose of Scotland the Brief and the comparative analysis in previous chapters. Let's take a brief look at Scotland's economic performing figures as part of the UK and without the full powers of a sovereign nation. If the conclusion of the last two chapters is correct, that being part of a poorly performing bigger nation is holding Scotland back from its full economic potential, then Scotland should still be doing okay and even beating the UK figures in some measures, but not booming. 10 economic indicators for Scotland's economy in brief. 1. Scotland's GDP in 2018 is estimated to be £178.6 billion, or £32,800 per person. This is £900 more than the UK's figure of £31,900 per person. 2. Scotland's most recent employment rate is 74.5%. Its unemployment rate is 3.7%, is a record low and less than the UK rate of 3.8%. 3. The employment rate for young people in Scotland rose to 61.6%, compared to the UK rate of 55.8%. Scotland's unemployment rate for young people of 7.6% compares well to the UK youth unemployment rate of 11.5% and is half the EU average of 14.7%. 4. Between 1998 and 2018, Scotland had the largest growth in full-time weekly wages of countries in the UK. In 2018, Scotland had the third highest full-time weekly wages of the 12 regions of the UK at £563, behind only London at £713 and the South East at £589. 6. Scotland's employment rate for women rose to 72%, higher than the UK average of 71.8%. 7. In 2018, output per hour worked in Scotland increased by 3.8% compared to 2017. Raising productivity is a key goal for the Scottish economy. The growth rate of gross value added per hour worked between 2007 and 2016 has increased by 7.8% in Scotland, far above any other UK region. However, UK productivity averages are driven by London's status as a global financial services hub, and this means Scotland lags behind London and the South East. However, UK productivity averages are driven by London's status as a global financial services hub, and this means Scotland lags behind London and the South East. 8. In 2017, Scotland's foreign direct investment, FDI, grew by 7%, which was higher than for the UK as a whole. The number of headquarters in Scotland is at a decade high. Scotland is now the second most attractive place to invest in the UK, ranking only behind London. Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen were in the top 10 of UK cities securing FDI projects in 2017. In terms of FDI-related job creation in Scotland, there was an increase of 104% in 2017, rising from 3,131 to 6,374. 9. Scotland's maritime industry generated $3.6 billion in gross value added, which represents 25% of the direct GVA impact of the entire UK maritime sector. The Scottish maritime industry supports around 39,300 jobs in Scotland, with a large proportion of the industry's employment being related to the marine, oil and gas services and operations. 10. Scotland's exports per head are £17,456 per year, versus £8,646 for the remaining UK, excluding Scotland. Observations. Scotland's economy is showing a remarkable resilience in the face of widespread economic mismanagement from Westminster, the threat of Brexit and the continuing wrong-headed UK government austerity policies. Although the data for Scotland is incomplete, it is more detailed than for other UK regions, and that helps map out the economic assets of Scotland as a nation. This level of detail is due in turn to the data demands of devolutionary policymaking and to the new economic questions being posed by constitutional changes taking place at a UK level in light of Brexit and the requirement it creates to revisit Scottish independence. While Brexit may be the trigger for a new independence referendum, even if it were to be cancelled, trust in the UK government as a competent economic steward of Scotland's wealth will have all but evaporated. A strong picture is emerging from the data, one that points to Scotland being far more likely to prosper as a smaller, more agile, sustainable and frankly more caring independent sovereign nation. You can purchase your own copy of Scotland the Brief at www.businessforscotland.com.
IndyPram, yes, IndyPram, on IndyLive.Radio. IndyPram, yes, IndyPram, on